We are going to start. We have a request coming directly from Marcus REDIKER. Please come closer to the stage so that Marcus can see you. Ian is the model student. So, good evening. Good evening and welcome to the 2022 edition of the summer school organized by the Academy of Global Humanities and Critical Theory, which is, as you may know, kind of joint venture of University of Virginia, Duke, and University of Bologna. So the Academy of Global Humanities and Critical Theory, I would put a special emphasis on critical theory tonight, because I think there is a need to reflect upon the status of critical theory in the hard times we are living through. We come from a global pandemic. We are still in the middle of this global pandemic. And since February, we are living in times of war. We are experiencing a war that is in a way different from the many wars that have characterized the last decades. So I think we have to reflect upon the very meaning of critical theory in such a critical conjuncture. And the summer school, in a way, is also understood as a kind of open space for such reflections. And let me say that it is not by accident that we kept the last event of the program open. I will facilitate it with Laurent Dubois, but the event is really open, and I hope we will find the ways to build the agenda of that final conversation together. As you all know, the topic of this year's edition is the sea, very wide and fascinating topic. We know, and we will explore in the next 2 weeks, the multiple roles that the sea played in the very constitution of global modernity and global capitalism. Closer to us, the sea has been a crucial space for the most recent wave of globalization. Maritime logistics has played, in this respect, a particularly important role since the invention of the container. Globalization, another stake today. I was speaking of the pandemic, the war, and we all know that both with respect to the pandemic and with respect to the war, this course is celebrating in a way the end of globalization proliferated. And this is another question we have an opportunity to test from the specific viewpoint provided by the sea in the next 2 weeks. But the sea is traversed by a panoply of powerful tensions and violent conflicts. In a way, we decided to prioritize 2 of them, the tensions and conflicts surrounding extraction at sea, and the tensions and conflicts surrounding maritime borders and migration. But we will also deal with a whole set of other questions ranging from oceanic histories to the cultural and the theoretical implications of climate change, once again seen from the sea. Nevertheless, we decided to start the program with a focus on the oceans as a site of struggle and insubordination. In a way, this decision has a methodological meaning, at least for me. Let's start from rebellions and struggles in our investigation of the sea. With such a topic, the first name that comes to mind is definitely the one of Marcus REDIKER, that I am particularly pleased to welcome to our summer school, although only online. I think there is no need to introduce Marcus REDIKER. I will just say that he is distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh and the author of many, many books on the rebellious sides of oceanic history. I will mention just a couple of them that were particularly important for me: Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, and the Many-Headed Hydra, co-authored with Peter Limbaugh. So there is the last thing I have to say, which means that it seems that several students did not register today, and they have the opportunity to do that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at the Department of History, just before the start of the first course. But now please join me in welcoming Marcus REDIKER to our summer school program.
Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Everything working? Okay, thank you. Thanks to Sandro. Thanks to my friends Raffaele and Matilda. A shout out to the people I've been working with over the last couple of years in the Hermeneutica group based at Sapienza University in Rome. They're very interested in the question of maritime radicalism, and I've learned a lot from them. So what I want to do today is to talk about my experience having written about the sea for almost 50 years now. I hate to date myself that way, but that's what it's been. And you might say that I have reached my anecdotage, telling stories about the things that I've seen. So let me begin those 50 years ago and talk about the state of thinking about the sea at that time. Seafaring people then were utterly marginal to history, to almost all kinds of history. Maritime history itself was a very minor field, amateur-based field, which nonetheless resulted in some very good work, but antiquarian and romantic. And to be honest, I couldn't even get labor historians to be very interested in the history of seafaring labor. They used to tell me that sailors didn't produce a commodity, so they weren't really part of the working class. This is how backward things were back then. So I've made it my life's purpose to try to illuminate two things. First, that history happens at sea. I know this sounds very simple, but there is a lot of resistance to this idea. Or to put the same point another way, the sea is a historical space. Crucial historical processes happen at sea. Okay, that's the first point. The second point is that seafaring people have long been extremely important historical actors. In fact, I would say in excess of their numbers, they've had a great impact on the way history has unfolded. So what I want to do today is to offer reflections on how I've thought about the sea and the people who use it. This, by the way, is not a comprehensive overview. I will not touch on many very important subjects, such as logistics or the important environmental histories of the oceans that are being written right now. I offer instead the notes of a working historian who has been thinking about these issues for a while. So here's what I want to do in my talk today. I'm going to discuss three basic themes. The first, the obstacles to thinking about the sea, as I have encountered them, and I suspect you have too. That's the first major issue. The second is, what happens if we get beyond those obstacles and see the real history of the oceans and the people who work there? Okay, so that's a second theme. And the third theme is I want to tell you a little bit about a new project that I'm working on with a group of scholar activists called Hydra Rising, which is about contemporary struggles and maritime solidarity at sea. Okay, so let's turn to the obstacles. The sea is not easy to think. It's not easy to think. There are a great many reasons why. I'm glad to see, by the way, that you have on the program Alan Sekula's film, The Forgotten Space. I think that's excellent. And his book, Fish Story, is likewise very powerful. I knew Alan, I worked with him, and I really consider him to be a leading figure on this subject. But let's think about some of the obstacles to thinking the sea. Okay, first of all, and fundamentally, as James Clifford pointed out years ago, the fundamental theories of society and almost the entire discipline of anthropology, for example, is based on the search for the landed and quite primitive society. Almost all of our concepts are based on landed societies. Sedentary landed societies, Clifford emphasized, even though people have been moving for very long periods of time. People have been much more in motion than we knew. And this too is very important for understanding people at sea, this constant motion. So the very theories of society that we work with are land-based. That's point number one. Second, and relatedly, is the overwhelming predominance for 2 centuries now of national and nationalist history, which of course glorifies the soil of the native land, carves up history, and falsifies it in the process. In other words, the way in which national histories operate is to reduce international influences, many of which happen by sea. So that's a second obstacle. National or nationalist history. A third is what I would call classical or neoclassical economic history. Now, this is international. This is not usually or often nationalist, but it is based usually on a kind of commodity fetishism in which the commodities of the world seem to move around all by themselves, with not a single living laborer anywhere in sight. This too makes it hard to understand what happens at sea. The sea is completely abstract in this process. So that's a third thing that we need to consider an obstacle. And a fourth out of 5 is the romantic conception of the sea. I think this has imparted a really distorted view of why people went to sea. And if we can use here the example of Ishmael in Moby Dick, who went to sea in a romantic quest for the self. And it's true that some people went to sea for those reasons, but the primary reason why people have gone to sea historically is pretty simple, and that is hunger. This romantic vision also has the unfortunate impact of focusing our interest on the struggle between human beings and the natural world, man against nature. And in doing so, it tends to erase the conflicts among the people who are trying to get a subsistence on the seas. So this kind of romantic view takes us away from conflict, takes us away from inequality, takes us away from struggles. Now, this is related in turn to another part of this romantic view of the sea. And if we could, Virginia, have the second slide. No, the one before. Yes, that right there. Okay, can you blow that up so that people can see it a little more clearly? Just a hit. Great, thank you. Okay, so part of the romance of the sea has to do with the tall ship. And we do know that they are elegant, beautiful things, do we not? There are about 200 replica ships around the world today. This is one from 1780, but to give a sense of why the romantic view of the sea points us in the wrong direction, I would just say to you that this is a slave ship. There's probably no way you could have told, but if you look very carefully, very near the waterline, there are airports carved into the side of the ship. And up above, there are nettings to keep enslaved people from jumping overboard. So this is a part of the romance of the sea, which hides some of the deeper purposes of the ship as a machine, as a technology. Okay, so the fifth, and in my view, the biggest obstacle to thinking the sea is something called Terracentrism. Now, this is a word that I made up literally about 20 years ago after many, many years of frustration of trying to figure out why people couldn't see the subjects and the themes that I thought were so important. There was a lot of exasperation. So I came up with this idea of Terracentrism, and basically have argued ever since. I no longer consider it funny, by the way, I just consider it crucial. This is a very powerful and uninspected bias in our modern way of thinking. And basically the bias comes down to this. Terracentric thinking basically insists that only the Earth's landed surfaces are real. Somehow the maritime spaces are unreal. They are ahistorical voids. They are in between the real spaces, which are both landed and national. Terracentric thinking is almost always national thinking. Okay, this bias is all the more powerful for no one really inspecting it. Now, I do want to say that there are exceptions to this terracentric bias, and they are naval history, for one, the history of maritime exploration, for another, the history of cartography would be a third, but in general, national histories tend to be strongly terracentric. The amphibious aspect of history has been lost by and large. And that's partly because the sea doesn't function in people's lives the way it did 100 or 200 years ago. People are more distant from it. The sea is a greater abstraction. But I do want to mention that terracentrism operates even in the studies of resistance. And this actually brings me to a subject that I'm studying right now. I'm right now writing a book about the literally thousands of people who escaped slavery in America, in the United States, in the period before the Civil War, roughly 1830 to the outbreak of war in 1861. Thousands of people escaped slavery by sea. This is almost totally unknown. One reason why is because this organized escape system, this network of escape, is called the Underground Railroad. Even though it was neither underground, nor did it take place by railroad, but this metaphor organizes our thinking, focuses us on landed routes of escape, and more or less erases the escape by sea. And what it also then erases is the docks, the waterfront, and ships as a zone of struggle against slavery. And some very fierce fighting against slavery went on in those places. So there's even a kind of terracentric bias in the study of resistance to slavery. Now, I do want to say, before we go any further, having listed all these problems and complaints, that things are improving. Things are getting better, no question. The sea has been rediscovered, so to speak, during the global turn of scholarship and politics, which has been going on now for about 15 to 20 years, the rise of the transnational, the rise of the global. This is very important for recapturing the sea as a subject of study. This kind of new history poses a great challenge to the national histories. And to be honest, the national histories just don't make a lot of sense anymore. So international and connected has been the actual history. There have been tremendously creative studies in oceanic history. Atlantic history has led the way on this, a very hot field of scholarship right now, exploring the connections between the maritime states of Europe, West Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Some extraordinary work has been done in Atlantic history, but we now have a lot of very important work being done on the Indian Ocean and its connections, and of course, the greatest ocean of them all, the Pacific. So this kind of work is extremely important, and it is developing. So world history, as a renewed emphasis, has actually played a big part in recovering the seas, because It's placed a new emphasis on indigenous seafaring in various places and on the connections between different maritime traditions. I think that's also very important. And we do now, by the way, have an overview written by Campling and Kolash called Capitalism and the Sea. I hope everyone will consider that. It's a very useful look at some of these big issues. Now, looking at this partial recovery or rediscovery of the sea, I must admit, I do take a fair amount of satisfaction in this because I see this as the revenge of the so-called marginal people. I've spent my career until fairly recently telling people that I study sailors, and they say, oh, you study those marginal people. And I always say, marginal to what? Certainly not marginal to the rise of capitalism. Certainly not marginal to the creation of the global system of slavery. Not marginal to that. But nonetheless, that has persisted. And now we can see that what might appear to be marginal to national history is central to oceanic history, world history, transnational history, because it is these seafaring people who provided all of the linkages to the continents. So they actually had a strategic importance in world history. And I think that is very, very significant. Okay, so let's talk now about what it is that terracentrism obscures. In other words, what does it hide? I think it hides primarily two things. First of all, as I've already said, it hides essential features of the history of capitalism. And relatedly, it also hides exactly how the history of capitalism happened. That's the first point. The second, it obscures the history of maritime radicalism, the history of people who fought back and in so doing shaped the trajectories of the history itself. Okay, so let me now introduce a second strange word, just as strange as terracentrism, and that word is hydrarchy. The root word is hydra, as in the many-headed hydra. This is a concept that was first used in 1631 by a man named Richard Braithwaite, who wrote that sailors live, quote, in a hydrarchy, end quote. Now, this is a concept that Peter Linebaugh and I developed in the many-headed hydra. I looked up the term in the Oxford English Dictionary, which says that this is an obsolete word, and it's defined as the watery realm or domain. Well, I'm sorry to say this about the Oxford English Dictionary, but that is frankly wrong. That's not the definition of hydrarchy. And you can tell that just by looking at the etymology of the word. From the Greek, hydra means water, and archy basically means the rule or sovereignty of. So oligarchy, the rule of the few; patriarchy, the rule of men; monarchy, the rule of kings and queens; anarchy, the rule of no one. Hydrarchy is fundamentally about power, rule and sovereignty, and who exercises it. That's crucial. Who exercises this power? Okay. It's also important that hydrarchy is a dialectical concept and that it must be looked at in two ways. There is hydrarchy from above and there is hydrarchy from below. Hydrarchy from above is basically the historical project by which states, nation states, projected their sovereignty onto the seas, creating blue water empires over vast distances. Hydrarchy from below is about the power and self-organization of seafaring people who are agents in the making of history, not only on behalf of the state, and sometimes they do that too, but also on behalf of themselves. Now, if some of you are interested in a working definition of hydrarchy, Let me give you that. It's brief and to the point. If you're looking for a less strange version of the concept, you can just call it maritime radicalism. Maritime radicalism, what is it? In my view, maritime radicalism is a set of interrelated practices of resistance to constituted authority at sea or ashore, as constituted or shaped by the mobile setting of a maritime vessel of some sort. Let me repeat that. A set of interrelated practices of resistance constituted authority at sea or ashore, shaped by the mobile setting of a maritime vessel of some kind. There are many different points of reference for hierarchy. It can be aimed at the power relationships of a ship, power relationships of an entire society. That could be about issues of race or class or gender or more than one at the same time. Hierarchy can also offer a critique of the nation state, of empire, and even at its grandest level of global capitalism itself. Where can you find hierarchy? You can find it on ships, in ports, on the waterfront, on the ocean, in rivers, and basically anywhere you can get to by water. These are the paths of hierarchy. And I do want to emphasize that this maritime radicalism is not confined to the sea. It comes ashore. It is amphibious. Storytelling is really crucial to maritime radicalism. These stories come ashore and they circulate broadly. And this is the kind of thing that I've been studying for these many years. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about hierarchy from above. And Virginia, if we could have the next slide, please. Okay. In my view, one of the most important technologies in all of world history is the European deep sea sailing ship. This is the technology, this is the machine that is more crucial to the rise of capitalism than any other, at least until we get to the steam engine in the late 18th century. This terror-filled rise of capitalism, this ship is an instrument of terror. It was a very complex machine, probably the most complex machine of its day. It was an engine of wood and canvas and hemp. And this is how Europeans projected their power around the world. This, what we're looking at here, is a third-rate man of war from the English Navy. And one of the things you'll notice, if you can see it, look carefully, this particular vessel, like almost all deep sea ships, is laden with cannon. Okay? Fernand Braudel said that the discovery of print, artillery, and the deep sea sailing ship were the three great technologies of the early modern era. The cannon, the artillery, and the ship are combined on the gunned warship. It was fast, it was agile, it had tremendous destructive power, and when it showed up in parts of the world that had never seen a vessel like this, it caused both wonder and terror. As a Spanish priest wrote, he says, it's enough to make those poor people worship Jesus Christ. Many called it a floating island. Now, here's one of the things that's very important about this. The ship is the place where the ruling classes of Europe learned a lot of their most important lessons about how to build a capitalist world economy. And it was especially important in learning to think about labor as a commodity. Okay, Virginia, if we could have the next slide, please. Now, here's an image that everybody has seen, I'm sure. This is an image of a particular slave ship called the Brooks out of Liverpool. This image was created not by a naval architect or by a merchant, but rather by an abolitionist group, the Society to Effect the Abolition of the Slave Trade in Plymouth, England in 1788. This became one of the most powerful pieces of visual propaganda that any social movement has ever produced. But what I want to call your attention to here is the way in which we can read this image as a process of the mass production of bodies. Really important to think about that. This image is industrial in the way that it looks. This is very sinister for that reason. And I've argued in this book called The Slave Ship, A Human History, that one of the most important things that the slave ship produced was labor power for global capitalism. Virginia, if we could have the next image, please. Now, I doubt you've seen this image, but it's very, very similar. This is a diagram of another naval ship, HMS Bedford, with a very different representation of labor power. What the artist has drawn is not the bodies of sailors, which would look very interesting if he had done it, but rather the hammocks in which they slept. So there's a kind of sleight of hand, right? You don't depict the human body that's in the hammock, you depict the hammock, and somehow it looks a little less brutal. And by the way, in case you're wondering, the blue hammocks are those of the sailors. The red hammocks are the hammocks of the Marines, who were basically an armed guard to keep the sailors from seizing the ships. Okay, and if we could have the next image, Virginia. If we look at them side by side, what I think we see here is a fascinating illustration of primitive accumulation, what Marx called primitive accumulation. Because what these ships did was basically connect sites of expropriation, for example, in West Africa, to sites of exploitation. This is a very important thing on a global scale. In other words, you can't build the colonies unless you have laborers, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and all the rest who have usually been connected from one part of the Atlantic to another. And I would also emphasize that this juxtaposition shows us that wage labor and slave labor were sold together on a world market. The ships actually linked maritime wage labor to the unfree labor system of the plantation. And indeed, these two systems cannot be conceived without each other. Okay, we can stop the slides for a moment. We'll come back to that one. If you could just turn off the slides for a moment, Virginia. Stop the screen sharing. Okay, thank you. So thinking again about this, just to conclude on this issue of the European vessel, this is what made the oceanic commons safe for private property. This is, as I've said, how European ruling classes projected their sovereignty and their imperial power around the world. And in so doing, using the ship, they also created the world market. And folks, I'll just put it to you simply. No ships, no world market, because the continents are not connected to each other. Ships and labor, the labor of sailors, knit the world economy together. Different regions were integrated at different times and at different speeds. This was not a uniform process. But the point remains that global capitalism depends upon the ship and its conquest of the seas through the agency of seafaring labor. And my most basic conclusion is this: almost all of the modern relations of capitalism are originally and historically mediated through the ship. Okay, that's how important I think it is. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about hierarchy from below. And if we could go back to that image, Virginia, I want to introduce this section of the lecture by quoting C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James once said, and this is the hinge or the transition from hierarchy from above to hierarchy from below. James wrote, I think it was in Notes on Dialectics, that the more capital organizes itself, the more it is forced to organize the working class. Now, this is basically James discussing an issue that Marx discusses in Capital, that basically with the centralization of capital comes the socialization of labor. The more centralized the capital, the more socialized the labor. And so what happens is this, and this is the transition to hierarchy from below. Capitalists bring workers into productive combination, both in specific sites and through the broader social division of labor. But once those workers are organized in that way, through cooperative labor, they begin to develop projects of their own. And this is really critical. Okay, so this is where hierarchy from below actually begins. Now, a few years ago, I worked with some colleagues on a book called Mutiny and Maritime Radicalism. This was a conference in a published volume that took place in Amsterdam. And what we came up with was about 20 different forms of maritime self-organization from below. There are actually a great many of them. And just like the heads of the many-headed hydra, these forms of self-organization are linked in a double sense. They're linked by common systemic causes, and they are linked by common participants and common experiences. Okay, this is crucial. I'll just talk about, fairly quickly, I'll talk about four of these forms of self-organization. The first, and one I've written about quite a bit, is piracy. Piracy, the golden age of piracy from the 1660s to about 1730, created a global crisis in the Atlantic world of capitalism. Pirates seized many thousands of vessels. And in the process of seizing those vessels, they also created autonomous organization on board the pirate ship, which was stunningly different from what these sailors had known on merchant or naval vessels, where hierarchy, violent discipline, poor quality food, low wages were the order of the day. On pirate ships, things ran very, very differently. First of all, they were extremely democratic. Pirates elected their captains and indeed all of their officers. They divided up their loot, not according to a wage system of great hierarchy, but in a very egalitarian way. They feasted constantly. They put away the lash for the most part. And if they did use the lash was never the prerogative of the ship captain, only the entire crew would vote over whether someone deserved to be disciplined. A collective sense was always brought to bear on any infraction. Well, it turns out that in the third generation of these pirates, in the years 1710 to 1720s, the proletarian element of seafaring really finally got control of these ships. That's when the more democratic, egalitarian social order was created. And that's the point at which the powers of Europe, the ruling classes of Europe, decided that they had to eradicate piracy once and for all. So what you see in this image, this is the hanging of a pirate named Stede Bonnet in Charleston, South Carolina in 1718. And you'll notice in the background, you'll see the ship's mast and people watching from above. This was an act of deliberate terror to try to convince sailors that if they do become pirates, this is what they can expect. So as it happens, it wasn't only the capture of merchants' property, which induced these rulers to come down so hard in this violent campaign of execution. It was the alternative social order that pirates had built at sea. I think that's important. And that is probably one of the purest examples of hierarchy, because it's rare for working people to get the opportunity to build the kind of society they want. Capturing the technology of the tall ship, this very powerful thing that we've been talking about, this machine, once they had captured that, they were free to do what they wanted. And what they wanted was most unacceptable to the powers that be. So that's one form of self-organization. A second, I won't spend too much time on this. I'm sure many of you know that it was sailors who invented the strike. In London, 1768, during a wage dispute. Sailors went from ship to ship, taking down the sails of the vessels. That's called striking the sails. To take down the sail is to strike the sail. They struck the sails, the ships couldn't move, capital couldn't accumulate, and the working class had a new kind of power. So the strike becomes another form of self-organization. A third is mutiny. Excuse me. And here I want to call your attention to an extraordinary new book by my friend and colleague, Nicholas Frickman, called The Bloody Flag, which is a history of the naval mutinies of the 1790s. British, French, Dutch, with other considerations of the Danish, Swedish, and American navies. The book is based on an extraordinary linguistic competence. And what Frickman finds is that the English historians knew only the English mutinies. The French historians knew only the French mutinies. The Dutch historians knew only the Dutch mutinies, but they were all part of the same movement. In fact, they had common participants because the international labor the maritime labor market was so international. So what Frickman, I think, has rightly concluded is that when we put all of these mutinies together, we have a revolutionary movement on par with the Haitian and French revolutions. But we didn't know about it because it got divided up into these national blocks that disguised its greatest power. So I do recommend that book to you, The Bloody Flag. Mutiny, committees, self-organization below decks and waging the mutinies and governing the ships. This is yet another very important form of self-organization within hierarchy from below. And then the fourth, which I want to mention, and this is going to be no surprise to the people involved in this session who are from Duke. I want to talk a little bit about a book called The Common Wind by my friend, the late Julius Scott. Folks, this is an extraordinary book. It's won several prizes. It's a book about how the word of the Haitian Revolution spread by sea around the Atlantic, in which a motley crew of sailors, the very same people who were involved in these other sorts of kinds of self-organizations we've discussed, began to whisper. They talked on the common wind. They carried the news of revolution and actually helped to inspire others everywhere they went. So once again, we see the ship as a purveyor of ideas. This is a very important part of this hierarchy and of history from below. It's an intellectual history from below. And I think Julius Scott captured that beautifully. So this is yet another example of hierarchy from below. So what is it that hierarchy at sea actually does? Or let's stand back and actually, what does hierarchy from above and below actually do? I mean, what are these world historical processes that are so important? Okay, first of all, class formation happens at sea. the rise of wage labor in the maritime labor market. Race formation happens at sea. A motley crew of sailors, a multi-ethnic, frequently multiracial crew of sailors arrives on the coast of West Africa and loads a multi-ethnic group of Africans on board. Those sailors having become in that voyage the white people, not because of the phenotype of their skin, but because they are in control of that technology. When they sail across the Atlantic, they unload those multi-ethnic Africans as members of a common, quote, Negro race, end quote. So we see that race formation is actually happening on the ships, but that's not all. There are other kinds of cultural formation that are really critical. Many historians have noted that on the lower decks of these slave ships, there's a powerful process of cultural creation going on among multi-ethnic peoples of West Africa, many of whom cannot understand each other in terms of language. So they start to develop new ways of speaking, new words, new ways of singing, new ways of dancing. There is powerful cultural creation going on the lower deck of these slave ships. If you look at this from one side, this is the creation of a Pan-African culture where accommodations are made. If you look at it from the point of view of the Western Atlantic, you can see this as the origins of African American culture, American in the broadest hemispheric sense. So these kinds of processes are crucial. And of course, one of the things that's going on the lower deck is the formation of a culture of resistance. Different means of resisting enslavement, which is carried off the vessel into the plantation societies of the New World, and where the people who were on board these ships will always regard each other as kinfolk. This creation of what anthropologists call fictive kin. It's an invented kinship, but it's no less powerful for that. So again, going on at sea, class formation, race formation, cultural formation, unless you are attentive to the seas, you will not understand these processes that are having such a powerful effect on landed society, okay? And let me just add one more point about hierarchy from below. Hierarchy from below, as you see in this very image, frequently suffers extreme repression, consciously inflicted death, the use of terror. But what happens frequently is that there is a kind of radical diaspora where the ideas of hierarchy go back onto the lower decks, go back underground, go back into the taverns, go back onto the docks, where they will coalesce and arise again a little later on. There is a kind of powerful, if hidden, history of maritime radicalism, and I think we're just beginning to understand the connections. Okay, if we could have the next image, Virginia. Okay, now I want to tell you about a new project called Hydra Rising. This is a project I'm doing with my dear friend Nandita Sharma, but also with Bridget Anderson, Cynthia Wright, and we have several other shipmates, some of whom actually might be there in the room in Bologna, for all I know. So let me tell you about Hydra Rising, and let me tell you why I'm especially happy to present this in Italy, because I have such enormous respect for the migrant solidarity movement that has grown in Italy in dealing with these migrants. And I would certainly welcome any feedback you might have about this portion of the presentation. So the centerpiece of this project is people crossing the Mediterranean in search of new lives and new livelihoods. And these people are conceived of as a head of the modern Hydra. Now, the oceans and seas, the Mediterranean in particular, is a special theater for these mobility struggles. And folks, that's what they are. They're struggles over mobility. Struggles over mobility have always been crucial to capitalism and resistance to it. And one reason why this is so important at sea is because despite that powerful machine called the man of war or the gunned warship, the vastness of aquatic spaces makes it difficult for capitalists to completely control in any sort of sovereign way. The seas are just too great to be policed in the way that land is done. Now, it's also very important to us that since time immemorial, these maritime spaces have been considered commons, where the laws of private property are not absolute. In fact, in many places, they're very weak. And indeed, they're often secondary to natural rights or to customary rights. The everyday resistance of migrant workers to today's worldwide immigration regimes constitutes, we think, one of the greatest challenges to the power of the contemporary Hercules. So at this point in the work, this project is really just getting underway. We have a big meeting of the participants on July 7th. I'd like to give you some of our guiding questions. We actually have more questions than answers at this point. And I would like to say that this work does build on what Sandro and Brett have done in Border as Method. The violence of border policing is extremely important to this project. How has movement been criminalized? How has it been criminalized? We're very interested in that question. There's some good work that's been done on that. How do citizenship and immigration controls, in turn, allow states to capture migrant workers as cheap labor available for super exploitation within national labor markets? This is another very important aspect of these struggles. Now, we are especially interested in the agency or the self-activity of migrant workers, whom we call runaways, fugitives, seafarers, and always world historical actors. We think that the origin of this resistance and this movement resides in refusing the idea that people need permission to move. So what are the strategies, the new strategies of resistance, and how are these shared through common movement? This is a very important question for us. How do migrants produce their own organic intellectuals? How, by taking action, do they make themselves into new subjects of history? How do they challenge the identities that have been thrust upon them, and in so doing, develop new consciousness based on their mobility? This is a really important question. You know, our study of consciousness is based on sedentary societies. People on the move think differently. So this is very important to us. How do migrants upset the normative order of rule by refusing the assumption that everyone has a place, their own landed national home somewhere, and they should just stay there? I mean, this really is a normative rule of modern society. We also are very eager to know what migrant workers can teach us, because in the process of taking action, they also transform the consciousness of the people who work with them in solidarity. And we do think, and this goes back to the idea of intellectual history from below, their dreams of liberation, and these from people coming from many different places, these dreams can help us to imagine a different future, one in which the earth becomes, as the great radical digger Gerard Winstanley said during the English Revolution, a common treasury for all. Now, there are some other specific questions we want to ask that have to do with the hierarchy from below aspect of this. How do migrant workers think about their own mobility? What kind of language do they use? What kinds of concepts do they develop to describe and understand it? Relatedly, what kinds of knowledge guide their way in their movements? How does the voyage change them? How does it change their relationships to each other? How does it change their relationships to the world at large? And most crucially, how have their initiatives from below provoked new measures of suppression and control from above? Again, there's been a lot of good work on this, but that's a really critical question. So our goal in this project is basically to reanimate the history and the maritime politics of the Hydra and to reimagine its power in the contemporary world. Even though no borders politics emerged from a specific set of political conditions in the late 20th century, we want to argue that this movement has important and frequently neglected antecedents in, for example, the anti-slavery movement, anti-colonial movements, feminist movements, anti-capitalist movements of all kinds, all of which we will explore. And let me just give you one example. In this book that I'm writing right now, the Underground Railroad, even though that's a misleading term, maybe we should call it the Overseas Sailway or Freeway. This is one of the first and most powerful migrant solidarity movements. Abolitionism is crucial to this, but also important, as my student Jesse Olsovsky has taught me, it was the runaways who actually educated the abolitionists about the true nature of slavery, which of course most abolitionists had never experienced firsthand. So by focusing on migrant workers as a main head of the many-headed Hydra, we hope to make clear that the No Borders movement is not simply an add-on to other projects, but is fundamental to questions of labor and freedom for the future. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much. And Virginia, you can take the slide down. I hope I wasn't too hard on the translators.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus, for this fascinating lecture. We'll have to talk about the last project that you presented to us. But the floor is open now. Questions, comments? Please.
Yeah. Hello. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
I'm an architect, so I come from a very different field. And my question is about the below. Does this below can become or can have a particular, I don't know, signification, power, because it's below, right? Which position is this below? Does it make sense what I'm saying? I'm asking about above and below. Above what and below what? Does that has any sense in when you start speaking about power relations? These position, these terms, what is the position of these terms?
Okay, sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I probably should have said that in using this language, history from above and history from below, I'm drawing on a quite important tradition in historical writing. The term was actually first formed, the phrase was first used, as far as I can tell, in France in the 1930s, in which French social historians began talking about the difference between elites and the history from below. A similar sort of thing happened in England. And then during the era of the New Left, historians like E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill, and Eric Hobsbawm developed what they quite consciously called history from below, meaning the history of the working class. And there are actually many different names that one could give to it. You could call it, as some people do, people's history. I tend not to prefer people's history because that can have a sort of conservative nationalist quality to it. It doesn't always, but of course, Howard Zinn wrote a very famous People's History of the United States, which is one of the best-selling histories from below ever written. You can also call it radical history. And it is a kind of social history. But I think history from below is the term that I use because it is associated strongly with movements from below, from movements of the dispossessed, movements of the expropriated, movements against the powerful, in which people are struggling for subsistence, for rights, and for power. So there's a tradition behind the use of this phrase.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture, and I would like to have the opportunity to thank to be able to be here in Bologna and take these opportunities. Amazing learning experience that I have, and I was wondering, as you started your lecture, how you point out a critique from a romantic view of the sea, and that people in history go to the sea for hunger. And as I was flying here, as I was over the Atlantic Ocean, and I was reading the Many-Headed Hydra to this summer school, I stuck in a piece, in a quote in your book from Bartholomew Roberts, that say that a pirate prefer a short life is a merrier one.
Mm-hmm.
And this link between freedom and precarity,
Mm-hmm.
where it seems, and we can think about migrants and refugees that are between spaces, are moved by precarity, and they are also freer in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if, taking consideration all the violence that sets these people in movement, that moved these people, is moved by something. If to be free is, you need to be you need to choose a more precarious life, a more vulnerable life, or if you can also take a longer life with a freer life as well, with more choices.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I love the question. Let me begin by saying that pirates had a great sense of humor, and it was a gallows humor in this sense. Now, you have to remember that the common sailor in that time probably wasn't going to live very long because of accidents at sea, or might be actually murdered by a captain, might fall overboard. You probably couldn't expect to live more than 7, 8, 10 years working at sea. So they basically felt, when they turned pirate, that they had nothing to lose. Therefore, that phrase that you mentioned, a merry life and a short one. It was also defiant, this idea, kind of in the face of the authorities. But it's absolutely true that their precarity and their sense of movement was really crucial to their sense of freedom. So I'm not sure I would formulate this as a rule, but I do believe that mobile people can teach us things, not least because mobility and the accumulation of property is also often not very easy. For example, just to draw an anthropology, nomadic social formations are usually much more egalitarian than sedentary ones. And I think that sailors were in many ways a kind of nomadic people. But I do think that this comes back around to the question of what can be learned from people in motion. You know, it may be that we can learn more about what a free life actually is. But the point that I would emphasize in your question is not that you need to choose a life of precarity, but you need to be able to choose to move. That's the key. And of course, this was at the heart of the struggle against slavery, which tried to immobilize people on the plantation. And the struggle to move was always really, really critical to the struggle against slavery. And I think this is true around the world in many places today.
Can you please tell us more about the alternative social orders that formed in Piracy and how it influenced the land societies and our ideas of revolution and of possibilities of social orders, alternative social orders?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, piracy is one of the first really early democratic experiments from below, and I really do see it as kind of an experiment. I think it had a tremendous impact on people at the time. In other words, you will find, for example, that when a pirate is going to be hanged in Boston, a huge crowd turns out to witness it, and the presiding Puritan minister, Cotton Mather, says, "Why is it that these pirates are heroes to these people?" I mean, they're literally heroes to these people because they respect the way they fought back against the powers that be. Now, the ruling groups tried to exterminate not just the democratic experiment, but the very idea of that, but that was not possible. So what we see is that in maritime struggles that bubble up years later, for example, leading to the American Revolution and a series of riots and outbreaks in the 1760s, some very similar ideas, sort of hierarchical ideas, bubble up from below. This is actually treated in the book that the previous speaker mentioned, The Many-Headed Hydra, the relationship between piracy and other movements from below. And then again, a generation later, you find very similar ideas emerging in these mutinies that Nicholas Frickman has written about. So I think there is definitely a kind of below decks continuity in the preservation of these ideas, but the problem is they are frequently preserved by stories rather than by written published works. You can find traces of them in a lot of published works, and I've done that, but the reality of it, I'm sure, was much, much bigger than what was published because these were, frankly, revolutionary ideas, and they were dangerous.
So speaking of the people on the move, do you think that modern days, the delivery drivers such as Amazon delivery driver are the contemporary version equivalent of those seafaring people? And if so, what kind of change would they make to the trajectory of history, or are they already making any changes? Yeah,
I love that question. I would say that they are very definitely comparable to sailors in the sense that they are transport workers. They have a degree of autonomy on the job, but they're fighting a much bigger corporation than sailors had to fight. So in some ways, the struggle is really difficult, but there's no doubt in my mind that if transport workers on land and at sea were better organized, this would be a tremendously powerful thing for rejuvenating labor movements everywhere. I think there is an inherent power based in their position in the division of labor under modern capitalism, and I think that power is just critical.
Professor, in the 5th chapter of the the Main Hydra, you mentioned the ship as a place where maroon communities could be formed. Do you see it as a nomadic experience during the transatlantic slave trade, or as a movement whose references can be found nowadays? If so, could you please talk a bit more about it?
Yes, this is also a very interesting question. I do suggest in the Many-Headed Hydra, and then again in the book Villains of All Nations, that in some ways pirate ships were floating maroon communities. And let me just emphasize that one of the reasons for doing that is because a surprising to me originally, surprisingly large number of people on board these pirate ships are of African descent. And some of them, no doubt, had actually been maroons in various places in the West Indies and in North America. So there's also evidence of sailors joining African-based maroon societies. There's evidence of that as well. So I think this is really crucial. In terms of contemporary equivalents, I mean, one of the things that has changed since the 18th century is that capital has a great deal more control over more of the Earth's space than ever before. So it is much harder now to find spaces outside the system, you might say. But I think some people are doing it in autonomous communes, both urban and rural. I think there are efforts to build these autonomous spaces. And I think maybe that deserves more attention as we think about the future.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm embedded in interesting work on the Indian Ocean and the Southern Ocean in Southern Africa, but also thinking with literary resources. And one of the things that emerges so strongly, of course, is that the sea, and particularly the undersea, is not a secular space. That one has to think with the political histories of insurrection, but also with the ancestral, with inspirited waters, as rendering complex, I suppose, those kinds of labor traditions in interesting ways. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. I mean, it almost seems possible to read the kind of inspirited waters, the ancestral realms, as dimensions of the political unconscious, as dimensions of the structural factors that are defining labor relations. But nevertheless, what is your comment on the non-secular histories that we have to take into account in critiques of capitalism as well? Thank you.
I like that question. Thank you. I'll just give an example of how the spiritual values drove the nature of struggle on board slave ships. I mentioned in in discussing the image of the slave ship at the beginning of the talk, that the ship captains put nets up around the rails to prevent enslaved people from freeing themselves by jumping overboard. The reason why this was such a problem was there was a very widely held West African belief, I mean, a kind of transcultural belief, was not limited to a particular ethnic group or region, that when one died at sea, one's spirit went home to Guinea, as they put it, going home to Guinea. So this actually made me rethink the whole question of slave ship insurrection, because in some instances, the goal was not to capture the ship because people didn't know how to sail it anyway, but rather to gain freedom, to get out of their chains, and then to jump overboard in order to go home. And just to put a kind of vivid point on this, there was a fascinating case of a ship's surgeon who saw a man get through the netting and get into the water in the middle of the ocean. And there were sharks all around, most likely. And he said this man was positively exultant because he had escaped the living hell of the slave ship and he was going home to his ancestors. So I take this very seriously, but the problem, of course, is that it's very hard to study because we don't have very many first-person sources which talk about spiritual beliefs. And this, of course, is a function of the extreme violence of the slave trade to begin with. And just to illustrate that, if you think of the port in West Africa called Ouida, from which about 1 million people were shipped out, expropriated and shipped out over the course of the slave trade, there are exactly 2 surviving first-person accounts. So the problem with understanding the spiritual motivations is that it's just, for the historical purposes, it's very hard to do. It's hard to get evidence. But for contemporary purposes in which you can interview people, I think it should be very possible and very important to do this kind of work, to do this kind of research, to understand what the deepest motivations actually are. And I do, by the way, completely affirm your point about death and inspirited waters. The Atlantic is a massive graveyard. I mean, there are literally millions of sailors and enslaved Africans whose bodies were thrown over the side of the ship and who are resting down there. That is a really important thing to keep in mind when you see these maps of the Atlantic. The seafloor is covered with bones.
Thanks so much for that that talk. I have a question that I think is, perhaps related to Sarah's, but from a slightly different angle, and that is about the status of human agency in your work in terms of what that means for the history of the sea. The many-headed hydra, the image that you showed us also is in many ways a non-human image, of course, and the question of different non-secular ideas of the sea also, of course, leads us to different kinds of understanding of why it is that the sea swells up at different moments, etc. And so I'm interested, I suppose, in understanding what the status of human agency means for a history of the sea, whether when you say, for example, that concepts of race, concepts of labor, concepts, there was another one that another idea that you used there, that they grow on the sea. Does the human also develop on the sea? So that would be one question to ask. But then another one would be, in this moment where we are thinking about different kinds of scales of history, non-human scales of history, where there's a return to an interest in the Annals school and non-adjectival history, as it were. What does that mean for the human and the sea in your understanding of it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think there are quite a few questions there, but let me do my best. And if I've missed anything, you'll remind me. Let's start with the question of agency. I personally believe that this is one of the most misused terms in contemporary discourse. It actually goes back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's father, of all people, talking about free agency in the context of Christianity. But it's come down to us more as a concept developed by E.P. Thompson, the agency of the working class, in his famous book. Thompson did not understand agency to be a matter of some sort of individual action. It was always collective. But now we find that brushing your teeth is an act of agency. So I think that, and of course, there are many different scales, and I don't want to denigrate all of the uses of the term, but I actually prefer the phrase used by C.L.R. James, which is quite different. He uses the term self-activity of the working class, by which he means the way in which, as people seek to escape oppression, exploitation, they engage in struggles, they organize themselves in new ways, and they do things that are frequently surprising and don't even have names yet. So the discovery of means of self-organization and liberation from below. This is actually the work that James did as part of the Facing Reality group in the 1950s. A lot of that in Detroit when he was working with auto workers. Marty Glaberman was part of that. George Rawick actually wrote a famous essay on working class self-activity. So I think that's actually a better term. But here's what I have always tried to do in studying either agency or self-activity, and that is to make sure that any discussion of that kind takes place in the context of understanding the structures that both create it and limit it. In other words, agency without structure to me is a big problem. And it's also true that agency has a history, and that history is frequently linked to the growth of revolutionary movements. For example, after the French and Haitian revolutions, it's possible to imagine revolution and agency in an entirely new way. So I think that's something we've kind of got to keep in mind. And of course, revolution has a variety of meanings, but in my view, we need to know what people are doing to free themselves. It's not enough, like, for example, it's not enough to look at what abolitionists do, what white abolitionists do. We have to look at the people who are taking the greatest risks in escaping slavery from the South and what their experience brings to all this. So again, this is abolitionism from below, as we might call it. Is there some part of your question I haven't addressed that you'd like me to speak about?
Thanks. I suppose I'd be interested in hearing your views on the scale of the different scales of history that are understood as not being tied to the human or the human.
Okay. Understood. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I don't think I have completely settled views about this, to be honest, but I've studied Herman Melville quite closely, and I'm very interested in the role of animals in Melville's view of the sea, and obviously Moby Dick is the best example of this. So I'm thinking now, and maybe you have thought about this more than I have, that we do need versions of history that are even more from below than the lower deck. In other words, what would the history of animals be like if we add this to the story? I still think that it's important for political reasons that we have human-based histories. I think that I still have the same critique of Braudel that I had when I first read it. That it's really valuable to have this kind of materialist geographical view with multi-levels of time and all the rest. But the dissolution of the human element into the structure, to me, is a serious political problem. And I have that same problem with other kinds of structuralism. But in terms of the place of the non-human and the other forms of life, The last book I wrote was about a man named Benjamin Lay, an 18th century Quaker, and a dwarf, by the way, who was one of the earliest proponents of animal rights. This was in the 1730s. It's not often considered to be a time for that set of ideas. But he had an extraordinary consciousness. He wouldn't ride horses because he felt that was exploiting horses. So I'm still kind of thinking about how this sort of view must and can become part of our history, because respect for the animals of the sea is crucial to any sort of future that we might have.
Thank you. I just wanted to first just say that I really appreciate the way in which you're trying to take the insights of, many-headed Hydra and other work that you've been involved with that has been sort of resolutely in the past in a way, but that was always read politically in the present. I mean, that's how Many-Headed Hydra was read by a large number of people to inspire conceptions of politics. And one little clue in the book that perhaps wasn't intentional, but was the category that wasn't historiographically rooted in your archives. And that was the category of the multitude. It's actually from here, right? So it's an interesting kind of twist. But it was read for that purpose as some kind of clarion call to our time. And now it's interesting to have you think about the present. And I guess I want to follow on the questions that have been asked, to just have you maybe speculate a bit about how we should think methodologically. In the Many-Headed Hydra, one of the wonderful things that was happening, as a reader, at least that I read in the text, which was different from the social history you pointed to, was that it attempted to think sort of culturally as well about this very specific archives of symbolism of the Hercules and the Hydra, which worked only for certain characters in the plot of the book, right? It animates the lives of only some of them, but then you run with it. And you find all sorts of other things. There's a wonderful thing in the Black Dog of Newgate, of the prison, where you see some kind of subaltern conception that's similar. Of course, you don't see it for all the wonderful, the figures. You don't have access to the archives of the enslaved or the colonized. And that pushes actually the reader to think that any account that's actually going to be post-Terracentric is also obviously has to be post-Eurocentric as well. That's one of the challenges the book offers the reader. And I think the question for our time also, you're right, of course, to say, Toni Morrison said it in one of her last essays, that we face the biggest migrant crisis since the transatlantic slave trade. So you're following in that wake. But then there's obviously also the climate crisis. The sea as graveyard is also the graveyard in that sense, with the bones and the coral. So what is adequate? It's obviously not a question just for you. It's maybe for your collective. It's a collective question, actually, for everyone in the room, everyone. It's what do we do collectively? Because we can't do it, and you're never going to find a category like the Many-Headed Hydra. It didn't actually do the work for everyone in that book either. It was suggestive. So maybe we'll never find a category like that. It's unique, right? The category of blackness that emerges from the Black Atlantic is unique. So maybe we don't find a category, but so methodologically, it can't be the human. It can't be the secular, Euro conception of a human. That has too much baggage. Well, we have to hold on to multiple radical traditions, and also the kinds of forms of counter-revolution that are brought against them, which is also part of your work, to face this confluence of the migrant and climate crisis, right? And the kind of general death of democracy everywhere. So methodological question about, bringing the insights of that massive text into this moment, these questions around the sea.
No, we cannot. Say something.
We cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, my mistake. I began by saying that I appreciated the challenge, the conceptual challenge. And I wanted to mention that Peter Linebaugh and I wrote The Many-Headed Hydra before the existence of the computerized search engine. So all the places where we found the Many-Headed Hydra, we could find thousands and thousands more. But here's what happened. Here's what happened in the course of writing that book. We started with the Many-Headed Hydra as a metaphor, but it very quickly became something else. It became a concept which permitted us to think simultaneously about class determinations and multi-ethnicity or mottliness at the same time. And there weren't very many options available for doing that. So we were consciously looking throughout that book for the languages of class that people were using at that time to help us understand their connections. Basically the same thing that I just said that we need to talk with migrant people about. What are their conceptions of what they're doing and what mobility means? So there was hewers of wood and drawers of water. There was the outcasts of the nations of the earth. And maybe most importantly, the motley crew. I think the motley crew is probably the concept that has gotten the most traction out of the Many-Headed Hydra. And I think it would be an interesting thing to compare it to multitude to see what the differing strengths and weaknesses are. But I did, by the way, one answer to your question about the present and the future, I did an interview with the magazine Radical Philosophy on the motley crew in the present. And this interview was conducted about a month before the murder of George Floyd. And I have to say that the protests did kind of prove the thesis of that interview. But the bigger question you pose, is any of this enough to meet the scale of the crisis that we confront right now? I don't know. I don't know. I think that there are, we're in probably the most complex political moment of my lifetime. And it is very hard to know exactly what we should be doing. But part of my purpose as a working historian is to try to show people that the things that they are fighting for, people have been fighting for a long time. And even though they didn't win, and sometimes they failed spectacularly, they were there, they were fighting, and we in the present are not alone. We have those people with us. They can be part of our imagination of the future.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the talk and for being with us. Yes. Okay. This is more of a reaction, I think, than a question, but maybe it will spur some thought on your part. And it leads a little off of what Ranji was asking about the kind of status of the development of the modern human on the sea. And also this question of above and below and the resonances that change when above and below moves to the sea. And it's a question around the senses and how the senses change. Because I'm thinking about a scholar at Duke with us, Lamont Aidu in Romance Studies. He has this idea of overseeing as a kind of the foundational gaze bound up with the primacy of vision in modernity. And this overseeing, of course, comes from the slave plantation and is a land-bound gaze in his thinking, as far as I know. But I'm thinking about overseeing transposed to the sea, particularly the image of the slave ship and the schematization of the primitive accumulation happening there, kind of requiring this top-down view of the ship. So I'm then wondering, like, that is, you know, okay, so we have, and to connect to the development of the human, I was thinking of a line in C.L.R. James's book on Melville, where he talks about looking over the edge, that humankind goes to sea, looks over the edge of the ship, and only sees ourselves reflected back in the water, which is a very beautiful image. That's development of the modern human at sea. It's also an image that maybe we would put pressure on. I think maybe we see other things too. But then, yeah, this transposing to the history from below at sea, I'm wondering, like, do the senses shift? Does the primacy of vision go away? And I was thinking about this, hearing everyone speaking, and I came to mind Fred Moten's notion of hapticality and the undercommons coming from the hold of the slave ship, touch, the history of touch in that space. And then I was wondering, you know, the further question I guess I was wondering is, what happens to the senses then when we transpose them even further under the surface of the water itself? And how do the senses become reconfigured in that space and in that materiality? What type of knowledge is produced from that reconfiguration? And maybe that has then something to do with the transhuman or animal questions you're wondering about now too. So just a series of thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just respond briefly. It is a bunch of interesting questions. I think this idea of overseeing is very important, and the importance of overseeing cooperative labor on the ship is critical. And you probably know, I think it may have been Peter Linebaugh who originally pointed this out, but the idea of the panopticon, which Foucault made so famous, wasn't actually originally Jeremy Bentham's idea. It was his brother Samuel, who was a shipbuilder. And so we think about the ship as a technology of control. I think that will help us to understand the importance of the gaze. In terms of the senses, here's one thing I can say about that. I do believe that in the close confines of a ship, where people, sometimes a very significant number of people, are in very close contact for a very long time, a lot of the senses are sharpened. Certainly, all manifestations of power, the subtlest expression of power is very, very clearly understood on board the ship. The slightest insult, the look of the eyes, the cock of the hat, right? So there is a profound sensitivity to power. And I saw this, by the way, when I was reading depositions by sailors in the High Court of Admiralty papers describing what went wrong that led to a mutiny. And it was frequently some very modest act of insubordination, or some what seemed relatively modest abuse of power, but it triggered something, and it grew into a very great explosion. So this is another way in which the ship is kind of a laboratory for power. What can you do? What can you get away with? What can you actually force human beings to do in this system of really extreme control? But the dialectical other side of that is that the sea, as a place of control, where the captain's authority is so extreme, primarily because there are no other disciplinary institutions around to help him, right? So there's no church, there are no civic associations, all the things that kind of keep society in a disciplined state. The captain has extreme authority, but on the other hand, that can be overthrown. And it can be overthrown a lot more easily than anything can be overthrown over land. So there is both extreme violence and oppression on board ships, you know, these theaters of flogging, for example, I mean, this is exemplary punishment. But there is a very powerful manifestation of the opposite, in which extreme ideas of freedom and democracy can also be enacted. So that, I think, would have some bearing on the history of the senses.
So thank you very much, Marcus. Let me very quickly hark back to what you were saying at the end of your lecture, to your new project. As you know, there are several projects in the Mediterranean nowadays. There are also several ships that are run by civil society organizations.
Right.
There is Alarm Phone. I guess you know about the project. Is a hotline operating 24/7 that plays a really very important role in coordinating search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. There is another project, forensic oceanography, and it will be the topic of a public event of the summer school next Monday. And that public event will be dedicated not only to that particular project, but more generally to the situation in the Mediterranean regarding maritime borders and migration. Next week, we will also have 3 members of Hermeneutica, the collective that Marcus was mentioning before. They will give a workshop in the afternoon. So there will be a continuity with your lecture today. And I also personally hope to have the opportunity to meet you soon and to discuss about your project, common projects. But for now, let me thank you very warmly for your lecture, for your generosity. And I mean, see you soon, I hope, in person in Bologna. Thank you.
I hope so too, Sandro, and thank you for everything. And you have no idea how much I wish I could be there with you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Virginia.
Grazie Francesco, grazie Michela.
Oh, Francesco, thank you. Thanks
you
for all your help.
Vi faccio vedere. Bye bye. See you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye. Francesco, ci sentiamo perché ho il testo anche per la prossima lezione, quindi insomma domani vi scrivo. Ok.